Here now to discuss the relationship between China and Europe, Cui Hongjian is in Berlin. He's the director of the European Studies Department at the China Institute of International Studies. From Belfast, Klaus Larres is a professor of history and international affairs at the University of North Carolina. In Beijing, Pt2 is a professor at Tsinghua University and a researcher at the London School of Economics. And Nicolas Veron is with us in the studio. He's a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and co-founder and senior fellow at Bruegel in Brussels. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Let us start in Berlin with Cui Hongjian. Cui Hongjian, the Asia-Europe Summit has kicked off on Thursday in Brussels. When we look at the current trade tensions between the United States and China right now, what kind of importance does this meeting in Brussels take on?
Yes, as we know now, this ASEM takes place at, I think, a very critical time for world trade and also especially for China, for Asia and Europe. How could we try to develop more, capability to protect this kind of a free trade and also multilateral cooperation? Because as we know, most of Asia and the European economies, they get so many, benefits from this free trade and the multilateral cooperation. But indeed, now, as we know, we are also facing very serious challenges from some unilateral or protectionism like that. So I think now it's a good time, and also it's a very crucial time for Asia and the European countries. Firstly, they need to get some more consensus, and they need to have some more common grounds. And they need to, promote some more connectivity and also promote this trade convenience, everything. And of course, I think that they also need to have some more, concrete cooperation projects. I think it also will be a very good time to change, the tradition of the ASEM. As we know, in the past, this forum, it's likely more, talk shop. But I think now, it's a time for this forum become a platform for more, pragmatic cooperation between Asia and Europe.
Right, Nicholas, of course, this summit comes at a very opportune time for both sides. But if we look at some of the facts on their trade relationship, the European Union is China's largest trading partner, and China is the EU's second largest trading partner. So these economic ties are very vital. What do you expect the summit to achieve?
I'm not sure the summit has short-term deliverables per se. Of course, there are bilateral relationships, as was mentioned in the segment, a free trade agreement with Singapore, of course. But I think it's more a question of coordinating position at a time when the global framework for free trade, for global economic and financial governance is undergoing some turbulence. We know that. It's not like all the problems come from the US and Asia and Europe see eye to eye on all topics. Yeah. There are topics on which Europe and the US have more common positions compared with some Asian countries, including China, for example. Competitive distortions linked to state-owned enterprises. China has reaffirmed the principle of competitive neutrality, but how to implement that is a big question. So I think for Europe, there is really the overarching interest of preserving a rules-based international order on a number of issues like climate change, like free trade. Asia is closer to Europe at this point on this objectives than the US is, but it's not coalesced in a fault line that would cut across all issues. So the world is in flux these days, yeah. And Europe is trying to keep everything as open as possible.
Right, but Nicholas, are you expecting to hear support for things like multilateralism, globalization?
Absolutely. I think, again, a rules-based international order is not only a rhetorical, but also a substantial objective to which both the European Union, the other European countries participating, like Norway, Switzerland, and more or less all Asian countries participating are committed to different degrees, certainly China, certainly the ASEAN countries, certainly Japan and Korea. So there is a broad basis of consensus on the rhetoric. Now, if you look at individual topics, I mentioned competitive distortions, industrial policies, intellectual property rights, then the discussion gets more complicated, and this is also a matter for not necessarily getting deliverables from the summit, but trying to get to a better understanding.
All right. Peter Ho, if we look at China's growth, its economy has been getting bigger and bigger. It's now the world's second largest economy, and part of that growth has been a reach out to the rest of the world. And one of its signature projects is, of course, the Belt and Road Initiative, which we heard about. How important is Europe to that initiative?
Well, Europe is enormously important for the Belt and Road Initiative. And you can actually see it sort of as a, there's of course a historical tie as well. I mean, it sort of is a historical reference to the Silk Road as well, where China had these long ancient ties between Chang'an and Rome. And what you see is that the Belt and Road Initiative is putting a lot of investments into Europe. Right now we have a direct link between London and EU-China, and we can expect that there will be more and more investments also, like for example in the port of Rotterdam. So the Belt and Road Initiative is hugely important. Having said that, there are also concerns at the European side about what these investments mean. And like what Nicolas already said before, is that ASEM is also important as a forum for dialogue. And the fact that there are differences of interests, that is something normal. What is now important in this changing political world, where multilateralism and free trade is more and more endangered, is that there is more emphasis on keeping these mechanisms for dialogue in place. And ASEM is one of these important platforms. Mm-hmm. And what you can see is that China has been doing a lot also to try to meet certain European concerns. For example, with regard to the Belt and Road Initiative, China has ordered its policy banks to have more cooperation with, for example, the European Bank on Reconstruction and Development.
Right.
China has, at the highest level, also said that China should be more sensitive to European priorities of infrastructure development. So, and you see that there is this dialogue in place, and that is important in the current world setting.
Klaus, let me bring you in. You know, as Nicolas told us a moment ago, there are challenges in these talks, in this relationship. He mentioned two of them, one being Chinese state-owned enterprises, the other being intellectual property rights. But let's look at one, let's call it a complication on the European side, and that is the Brexit negotiations. How do these negotiations between the European Union and China impact that in any way?
Yeah, as the other speaker said, this is an important meeting. We have already had the EU-China summit in May of this year, which was also an important meeting. Now we see the second step on this road, and to overcome any problems like a lack of reciprocity, market access, and things like that. And I think at the working level, European-Chinese relations are very good and quite pragmatic. They are being approached in a very pragmatic way. But it is, of course, on the level of, on the high level, like reciprocity of market access, that we have problems. And I think there is an inclination by the media to think that this summit will be about an anti-American summit, that it is an attempt by the Chinese to lure the Europeans on their side against the United States. And I think that is probably not the case at all, because there's no prospect of this going to happen. As far as the grievances are concerned, the grievances the United States has, as we recently heard in that speech by Vice President Pence, who expressed his grievances in a very robust way, I would say, that many Europeans, most European countries would agree with many of the sentiments he expressed. But that doesn't mean that they would use the same methodology to approach these grievances. While there has been talk about a new containment policy as far as the United States is concerned, that's certain. I don't know whether that is really correct, but that is certainly not the approach the Europeans take. The Europeans have a very much a policy of engagement and of constructive negotiations, and I think the summit in Brussels is an example of that.
Klaus, I take your point about some of the media portraying this as an attempt to isolate the United States and reinforce the bond between China and the European Union. But philosophically, the Europeans and the Chinese are on the same page, aren't they, when it comes to things like globalization, when it comes to things like dropping barriers, getting rid of protectionism?
Yes, of course. You know, the Europeans and the Chinese share an awful lot of common sentiments about a lot of joint initiatives they have been worked on together. That is, for example, the Paris Climate Summit, where, you know, the Chinese and the Europeans were very actively involved, of course. That was the Iran nuclear deal, where there's really a large agreement between most European countries and China to, if possible, continue that deal. And there are many other issues where the Europeans and the Chinese agree. But of course, as always in international politics, you don't really talk about the things you agree on, you are happy with. What is contentious is, of course, all the many things which where you don't agree. And that is really what needs to be discussed, you know.